They laughed when the janitor touched the crash cart until the patient stopped breathing. In that frozen moment of panic, the nurse who mocked him stood helpless, watching the man she'd belittled move with impossible calm. His hands, once meant for mops, now steadied the line between life and death, and in one breath, every assumption in that room changed forever. The day had barely begun, but Daniel Reeves was already at work, grey uniform pressed, name tag slightly faded, mop bucket gliding quietly beside him. His steps were measured, his presence unassuming. Most people passed him without a glance, the way one might overlook the hum of a fluorescent light. Constant, necessary, invisible. He'd grown used to it, the way nurses stepped around him mid-conversation, or how interns ignored his polite greetings while buried in patient charts. Yet Daniel carried no bitterness in his eyes, only a quiet endurance, the kind that grows from long years of learning when to speak and when to stay silent. He found rhythm in repetition. The sweep of the mop, the squeak of the bucket wheels, the muted chatter of the ward. Still, every sound reminded him of a world he used to belong to. The beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic, the murmured codes echoing through hallways. They were once his battlefield. Years ago, Daniel wasn't a janitor. He was paramedic Daniel Reeves, a name spoken with respect, known for quick hands and steady nerves. He'd saved lives on highways, in stairwells, in the rain-soaked alleys of the city. He'd felt adrenaline like electricity in his veins, the siren his anthem. Until one night, one decision changed everything. It had been raining hard that evening, a blur of headlights, hydroplaning tires, and a screech that still haunted him. He wasn't on duty, just driving home. But when he saw the overturned car by the bridge, instinct took over. He pulled over, rushed through the downpour, and found a young man trapped inside, barely breathing. There was no backup, no oxygen tank, no sterile gloves, just Daniel, his training, and the pounding of his heart. He stabilized the neck, cleared the airway, did everything by the book. Almost everything. When emergency responders finally arrived, the man was breathing, but barely. Daniel had saved him, or so he thought. But the next day, a complaint surfaced. He'd performed an unauthorized procedure without proper supervision. A minor complication, one that could have happened to anyone, was blamed on him. The system that once praised him suddenly needed someone to blame. His license was suspended pending review. Months later, a letter arrived. Not reinstatement, but revocation. One sentence sealed his fate. Gross procedural violation under off-duty circumstance. That letter stayed folded in his wallet for years, creased, yellowed, unread, but unforgettable. He tried to fight it. Lawyers' appeals, endless waiting. But bureaucracy moves like mud, and compassion rarely outweighs liability. Bills piled up, rent overdue, savings gone. Eventually, the man who once raced to emergencies found himself pushing a mop down the same corridors he used to run through with a stretcher. He told no one his story. It was easier that way. Easier to let them see him as Daniel the janitor, harmless, quiet, replaceable. Some nights, when the hospital emptied into a ghostly calm, he'd pause outside the trauma ward, watching through the glass as doctors performed procedures he could still name by heart. He'd trace the rhythm of their hands, compression, suction, ventilate, like a musician recalling a song he was forbidden to play. Yet despite the ache, Daniel never left. He couldn't. The hospital was the last echo of who he was, and cleaning its floors felt like a way to stay close to the life he'd lost. There was a strange peace in it, too, knowing he could still make something sterile, something safe. His way of saving lives, quietly. But not everyone saw it that way. Some of the younger nurses treated him like background noise, their jokes disguised as harmless banter. One of them, Nurse Clara Whitmore, stood out the most. Sharp, ambitious, always on edge. She hated mistakes, hated interruptions, and hated when anyone touched things they weren't qualified to handle. To her, Daniel was a liability in motion, polite but misplaced. She'd once caught him picking up a dropped syringe tray, and instead of thanks, she'd hissed, "Don't touch that. You don't even know what half this stuff is." Daniel had just nodded, murmured a quiet sorry, and kept cleaning. But she turned away, muttering, "Janitors should stay in their lane." The word stung, though he didn't show it. He'd learned long ago that pride doesn't heal wounds, silence does. Still, sometimes, when the hospital lights dimmed at night and the corridors emptied, Daniel would glance at the emergency equipment, his fingers twitching with muscle memory. He'd whisper the steps of resuscitation under his breath, not because he hoped to use them again, but because forgetting felt like dying twice. That was his quiet tragedy, a man born to save lives, condemned to sweep around them. But fate, as it often does, had not forgotten him. Daniel's days followed a steady rhythm. Clock in, clean, disappear. He worked quietly in the ICU wing, where tension floated in the air like static. Doctors came and went, nurses whispered in clipped tones, and patients' monitors beeped like heartbeats, marking time. He moved through it all like a shadow, steady and unseen, leaving gleaming floors behind him. But beneath that calm exterior lived a restlessness he couldn't shake. Every crash cart he passed seemed to call to him. Every emergency announcement made his pulse quicken. It wasn't ego, it was instinct, the same reflex that once made him sprint toward danger when everyone else froze. Now he simply pushed his mop, trying to convince himself that his hands belonged on a handle, not on a human chest performing compressions. Clara Whitmore, the nurse who'd scolded him weeks earlier, had a reputation for being brilliant and exacting. She'd clawed her way up through long shifts and sleepless nights, determined to prove herself in a hospital that too often dismissed young women. But that drive came with sharp edges. Any mistake by others felt like a personal threat, and any sign of imperfection, even from a janitor, set her off. To Clara, Daniel's silence looked like ignorance. His calm looked like indifference. She never asked what brought him there, never imagined that the man mopping the hallway once held lives in his hands. Their paths crossed often, though always briefly. She would bark orders at interns, check vitals, and occasionally step around Daniel with a quick, "Careful, don't block the cart." He'd nod, move aside, and quietly continue cleaning. No resentment, no complaint. That composure irritated her more than any backtalk could have. It was as if he existed in a world where her authority didn't matter. One evening near the end of his shift, Daniel lingered by the staff lounge. Through the cracked door, he overheard laughter, Clara's voice among a few younger nurses. "You wouldn't believe it," she said between chuckles. "The janitor actually told me once to watch my step near the crash cart, like he's in charge of safety now. I swear, some people forget their place." A ripple of laughter followed. Daniel froze for a moment, his mop handle resting lightly in his hand. He wasn't angry, just hollow. That kind of laughter no longer surprised him, but it still found the soft spots. He stepped away quietly, the sound of their voices fading behind him. Later that night, when the corridors were empty and the lights dimmed to a pale blue, Daniel paused outside ICU room 12. Inside, an old man slept under the glow of monitors, his breathing shallow, rhythmic, fragile. Daniel stood for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the patient's chest. He'd seen that rhythm thousands of times before, life holding on by threads. He whispered softly to himself, half a memory, half a prayer, 2 inches deep, 100 compressions per minute. Keep the rhythm. His fingers moved unconsciously, pressing against the air in silent rehearsal. Behind him, a voice broke the stillness. "Practicing for something, Reeves?" He turned to see Clara, arms folded, eyebrows arched. Her tone was light but edged. "Just keeping my hands busy," he replied softly. "You're supposed to mop floors, not train for CPR," she said with a dry laugh. "You're not on the medical team." "I know," he said, his voice calm, eyes lowered. Old habits. Something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't defiant, it was weary, like someone remembering a life they no longer owned. She hesitated for a moment before brushing past him. "Just stay out of the way, all right? This ward doesn't need distractions." Daniel nodded. "Understood, ma'am." When she disappeared down the hallway, he leaned against his mop handle and closed his eyes. He didn't blame her. She didn't know. How could she? People rarely see beyond uniforms, and his had long since stopped telling the truth. That night, as he walked home through the drizzle, he passed an ambulance parked near the emergency bay. Its engine idled softly, the faint blue lights reflecting off wet pavement. The sight stirred something deep within him, nostalgia, maybe longing, maybe grief. He stood still until the ambulance pulled away, its siren a distant echo of the life he once led. Daniel knew, even if he'd been stripped of title and license, the part of him that saved lives had never left. It simply waited, quietly, patiently, for the world to remember him again, and soon it would. The hospital came alive before sunrise. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and burnt coffee, the sound of heels striking linoleum echoing like a war drum. Nurses changed shifts, doctors murmured over charts, and somewhere deep in the building, a machine alarmed, short, sharp, insistent. Daniel Reeves was already in his uniform, the faded grey shirt tucked neatly, his ID clipped low. He pushed his mop bucket down the hall toward the ICU, his mind tracing the same mental checklist he followed each morning. Empty trash bins, disinfect the isolation room, polish the floor before visiting hours began. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed. Inside the ICU, Nurse Clara Whitmore was having a morning that tested her limits. She'd been covering double shifts for 3 days, straight after a flu outbreak hit half her staff. Her patience was thin, and the pressure showed in every tight movement of her hands. Charts piled on the counter, patients with unstable vitals. One short-staffed doctor running between bays. By 7:30 a.m., she'd already snapped at 2 interns, spilled coffee on her scrubs, and realized she hadn't eaten since the night before. She was exhausted, running on caffeine and pride, a dangerous mix. When Daniel pushed open the side door with his mop and bucket, she barely noticed him. He moved quietly, pausing by the crash cart to wipe the floor around it. Careful not to disturb any equipment, but Clara's eyes flicked toward him mid-sentence, irritation flashing across her face. "Reeves," she barked. "Not here. We've got sterile equipment out." Daniel paused mid-wipe. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just clearing a spill near the cart." Her tone sharpened. "Then wait until the bay's cleared. We don't need cross-contamination," he nodded, stepping back immediately. "Understood." But as he turned the mop handle, a metal tray perched on the edge of the counter tipped slightly. One of its surgical clamps teetered, sliding toward the floor. Without thinking, Daniel reached out, steadying it before it could fall. The movement was instinctive, reflexive, but to Clara it looked like interference. Her voice sliced through the room. "Don't touch that." Every head turned. The 2 interns froze. Even the steady hum of monitors felt louder. Clara's face was pale but fierce. "That's sterile equipment. Do you have any idea what could happen if—" Daniel held up both hands, palms open. "I didn't mean to." "That's the problem," she snapped. "You don't mean to, but you don't belong near this equipment. You clean floors, not save lives." The words hit like a slap, sharp, public, humiliating. A silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. One of the interns glanced at Daniel, guilt flickering in his eyes, but said nothing. No one ever said anything. Daniel lowered his gaze, his voice even. "I understand. I'm sorry." He stepped back, collected his mop, and left the ICU without another word. Clara exhaled hard, rubbing her temples. The adrenaline had already soured into regret, but pride kept her silent. "Let's move on," she muttered, returning to the patient charts. Outside, Daniel stood in the hallway, his reflection wavering in the polished floor. For a moment, he just watched it, a tired man in a janitor's uniform holding a mop like a crutch. His jaw tightened, but his eyes remained calm. He'd been through worse, much worse. A few moments later, a faint beeping from inside the ICU broke his thoughts, an alarm, persistent and high-pitched. Clara's voice cut through. "BP dropping. Get me the chart now." He turned slightly, instinct tugging at him like gravity. Inside, monitors flared red. Patient in bed 3, a middle-aged man recovering from bypass surgery, had gone into tachycardia. His pulse was spiking, pressure falling. Clara barked orders as the intern scrambled to assist. "Push 1 milligram EPI," she called out. "Oxygen up to 15. The team moved quickly, but something wasn't right. The doctor on call hadn't arrived yet. One of the interns fumbled the IV line, and the heart monitor screamed a long, continuous tone. Clara's voice rose, trembling slightly. "Where's the crash cart?" "Move it closer!" The intern tried to wheel it around, but one of its wheels jammed on the polished floor. It wouldn't budge. The cart tilted slightly, one drawer sliding open. From the hallway, Daniel could see the struggle, the hesitation, the fear, the second-guessing. His body tensed, every old reflex firing at once. He knew that sound, that chaos, that look on a nurse's face when seconds meant everything. For a brief, dangerous moment, he stepped toward the door, then stopped. He couldn't, not again. Inside, Clara's voice cracked. "Get that cart now! He's crashing!" The intern yanked harder. The drawer banged shut. The cart lurched forward. The patient's monitor flatlined. Clara's throat went dry. She stared at the screen, frozen, as everything around her dissolved into motion. The interns fumbling, alarms blaring, the room contracting into panic. In the doorway, Daniel's knuckles whitened on the mop handle. He could feel his heartbeat sinking with the machine's shrill tone. Every instinct screamed at him to move, but the memory of that letter, gross procedural violation under off-duty circumstance, echoed louder. He stood still. Then a voice over the intercom. "Code Blue, ICU, Code Blue." The words ripped through the hall like lightning. Daniel took one step forward, then another. He couldn't fight it anymore. The instinct was stronger than fear, stronger than shame. He was halfway to the door when Dr. Patel, the attending physician, stormed in, coat flaring, gloves half on. "What's happening?" he demanded. "Patient in arrest," Clara said quickly, moving aside. "Starting compressions, charge to 200, Patel ordered. "Clear the line." The intern scrambled. Daniel froze just outside the glass partition, watching the doctor's practiced rhythm. His hands twitched, his mind already counting the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe. For a moment he thought they had it under control, but the monitor remained flat. Clara's voice cracked again. "No response, doctor. Charge to 300. Still nothing." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reset the paddles. Sweat dotted her forehead. She was competent, always had been, but right now she was running on exhaustion and fear. Her rhythm was off, her composure cracking. "Ma'am," one intern stammered, "should we just do it?" She snapped. The defibrillator whined. Static filled the air. Daniel couldn't breathe. He could see the error, the placement slightly wrong, the timing off. The patient's chest barely rose between shocks. His mind screamed corrections. Adjust angle, realign, recompress, don't break rhythm. He whispered under his breath, almost praying. "Please, just one proper cycle." The second jolt hit. "Still nothing, doctor," Clara said, panic rising. "He's not responding." Dr. Patel's jaw tightened. "Get respiratory in here now," Daniel's heart pounded. He knew what came next. Oxygen saturation dropping seconds, stretching thin. He could feel it through the glass, like static, and somewhere deep inside, the part of him that once saved lives began to wake again. The steady, unbroken flatline pierced the air like a scream no one could silence. The ICU was chaos, a blur of motion, panicked breathing, clattering metal. Dr. Patel's commands grew sharper, Clara's movements faster, but control was slipping. Fear had entered the room, and everyone could feel it. "Switch compressors," the doctor barked. "Charging again. 300. Clara's voice trembled. "Clear." The patient's body jerked under the shock. The monitor blinked, flickered, then returned to the same merciless line. Dr. Patel swore under his breath. "We're losing him." Clara's throat tightened. She'd seen this before, but never when she was leading. She glanced around the room, the interns' wide eyes, the pale faces. Her own hands were shaking, and in the glass reflection beyond the partition, she caught a glimpse of Daniel Reeves, still silent, watching. For a split second, anger flared again. Why was he standing there? Why couldn't he just leave? She turned back toward the patient, her jaw set. "Get the airway!" But Daniel was already moving. One of the interns had fumbled the suction tube, letting it coil around the crash cart wheel. Daniel pushed the door open before thinking, ducking inside, his steps quiet but firm. He reached down, unclipped the tube, and handed it over without a word. "Reeves out!" Clara snapped immediately. "You can't be—" Then she saw his eyes, calm, precise, focused. Not the eyes of a janitor. the eyes of someone who knew exactly what was happening. Dr. Patel didn't look up. "Who is this?" "Custodian," Clara hissed. "He's not supposed to—" But Daniel's voice cut through, low and steady. "You're hyperventilating him." The doctor's head snapped up. "What?" Daniel pointed, not rudely, just decisively, toward the ambu bag. "You're pushing too much air, too fast. You're decreasing venous return. Slow compressions. 2 inches deep, 100 per minute. Give me the count." For half a second, the room froze. An absurd image, a janitor giving instructions to a medical team. But Daniel's voice carried authority born from muscle memory, not arrogance. Dr. Patel blinked, then looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation dipping, chest barely rising. The man wasn't wrong. "Do it," Patel ordered. "Switch out. Give him space." Clara stepped back, her heart pounding, torn between fury and disbelief. Daniel moved in beside the bed, rolling up his sleeves. His palms found the center of the man's chest with practiced precision. 100 compressions per minute, he said under his breath. Steady, consistent. The sound filled the room, sharp, rhythmic thumps, the heartbeat of determination. The monitors began to flicker. Clara's gaze darted between Daniel's hands and the doctor's face. His form was perfect. The technique, the timing, everything about it screamed training. Patel's voice softened. "You've done this before." Daniel didn't look up. "Used to." They cycled through compressions and shocks. 3 rounds. Sweat darkened Daniel's collar, his breathing shallow but steady. When the defibrillator charged again, he nodded to the doctor. "Now." "Clear!" The jolt surged through the patient's body. The monitor stuttered. A pause, a whine, then the smallest blip. A heartbeat. The room fell silent. Then another blip. Then rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Clara exhaled sharply, her knees nearly giving way. The doctor leaned against the bed rail, eyes wide. "Pulse is back," he murmured. Daniel stepped back slowly, chest heaving, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Clara found her voice. How did you know that?" He hesitated. "It's what I used to do." Patel turned toward him, studying him like a riddle. "You were medical." "Paramedic," Daniel said quietly. Before I lost my license." The room was still. The beeping monitor felt deafening now. The sound of life returned, a metronome of irony. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. The mop, the gray uniform, the quiet eyes. How many times had she spoken down to him without knowing who she was talking to? Patel straightened. "You just saved a life, Mr. Reeves." Daniel shook his head. "The team saved him. I just reminded him how to breathe." He turned to leave, but Clara's voice stopped him. "Wait." He paused in the doorway. Her face was pale, her expression unguarded, all the sharp edges gone. She faltered, glancing at the interns who were still watching. "Thank you." Daniel gave a small nod, almost a bow. "Just doing what needed to be done." Then he walked out, quiet as he'd entered, leaving the team in stunned silence. Outside, the corridor seemed brighter, the sterile air lighter somehow. Daniel leaned against the wall, his pulse slowing, his palms still trembling. He didn't know if what he'd done would get him fired or thanked, maybe both. But for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Purpose. Inside the ICU, Clara stood frozen beside the patient's bed, watching the steady rhythm on the monitor. Dr. Patel approached her, voice low. "You okay?" She nodded faintly. "Yeah, She stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought he was just a janitor." Patel gave a dry smile. "No one is just anything in a hospital. You'll learn that." As he walked away, Clara glanced toward the doorway, where Daniel's shadow had vanished. For the first time in her career, she felt something that no textbook had prepared her for: humility. That evening, she stayed long after her shift ended, rewriting reports, replaying the scene in her head. The sound of the monitor still echoed in her ears, the heartbeat that had returned because of the man she'd humiliated. When the floor finally emptied and the night shift took over, she found Daniel in the supply corridor, quietly refilling a cleaning cart. The sight of him Same grey uniform, same calm face, made her throat tighten. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly. He looked up, surprised but polite. "Yes, ma'am? I wanted to—" Her voice faltered. The words didn't come easily for her. "I wanted to apologize." He blinked, expression unreadable. "For what?" For how I've treated you," she said, voice low. "I spoke down to you. I didn't know." Daniel smiled faintly, tired but kind. "You didn't have to know." "I didn't tell you." "That doesn't make it right," she whispered. For a long moment they stood in the dim hallway, two people bound by the strange silence that follows redemption. Finally, Daniel spoke, voice gentle. "It's all right. You learned something today, so did I." "What's that?" "That sometimes helping people isn't about what you're allowed to do. It's about what you're meant to do." She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "You should have never lost your license." Daniel gave a soft chuckle. "Maybe I didn't. Maybe I just needed to remember who I was." As he turned to leave, Clara called after him. "Reeves?" He looked back. "You saved him." He hesitated, then smiled. "We both did." And with that, he pushed his cart down the hall, the soft squeak of its wheels fading into the hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet music of a man returning at last to himself. The next morning the hospital hummed with an unfamiliar energy, half awe, half rumor. Word of what had happened in the ICU spread faster than any official report could manage. It started as whispers at the nurses' station, then moved through the corridors, carried in bits and fragments. The janitor saved a patient. The guy used to be a medic. The nurse froze and he took over. By mid-morning, everyone seemed to know something, though no one knew the full truth. Daniel Reeves arrived for his shift like he always did, uniform crisp, ID badge hanging low, bucket squeaking faintly against the freshly waxed floor. But the eyes that met him were no longer indifferent. Some were curious, some quietly respectful, others wary. He didn't like the attention. As he mopped near the nurses' lounge, snippets of hushed voices drifted from behind the door. "It's true. Dr. Patel said the guy performed compressions like he'd done it 1,000 times. I heard he used to be an EMT, or a paramedic, something like that. Then what's he doing here?" The door swung open suddenly, and two young nurses stepped out mid-conversation. Their chatter halted when they saw him. One of them managed an awkward smile before turning away. The other muttered something under her breath that Daniel pretended not to hear. He just kept cleaning. The mop glided across the floor, steady as his heartbeat, his expression unreadable. But inside, something twisted. That same quiet fear that always came when his past tried to crawl out of the shadows. He'd rebuilt a life around anonymity. He'd learned how to disappear while standing in plain sight. And now that piece was cracking. Clara Whitmore hadn't slept properly. The image of the patient's chest rising again, the sound of that first heartbeat, replayed in her mind every time she closed her eyes. Shame, gratitude, confusion, it all mixed into a storm she didn't know how to process. For years, she'd believed hierarchy defined competence. Doctors led, nurses followed, janitors cleaned. But what Daniel did shattered that illusion, not through rebellion, but through grace. That morning, she lingered by the staff board, pretending to check shift schedules until she spotted him down the corridor. He was bent over a trash bin, methodically tying a bag. Every movement was deliberate, almost meditative. She hesitated before walking over. "Mr. Reeves," he straightened slowly, turning toward her. His face was calm as always, but his eyes carried the softness of someone waiting for judgment. "Morning, ma'am," he said quietly. "I was wondering if we could talk just for a moment." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." They stepped into a small break room, the kind filled with stale coffee smell and the low hum of a vending machine. Clara folded her arms, eyes on the table. "I spoke with Dr. Patel this morning." Daniel waited. "He told me what he found out about you, that you used to be a paramedic." A faint smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "Used to be," he said softly. "He also said the only reason that patient's alive is because of you." Daniel's gaze dropped to his hands, calloused and dry. "There were others in that room, Nurse Whitmore. I just did what anyone would have done." Her voice rose, emotional. "No, not anyone. You knew exactly what to do. You didn't hesitate." She stopped, swallowing hard. I froze. He looked up then, meeting her eyes with the calmness of someone who'd long stopped blaming others. You were tired, overworked, it happens. She shook her head. You don't understand. I mocked you, Daniel. I treated you like you were beneath me. And when it mattered, you did what I couldn't. How do I live with that? Daniel studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. You learned from it. You carry it not as shame, but as weight. The kind that keeps you grounded. Clara exhaled shakily, nodding, her eyes glistening. You're a better man than most doctors I've met. He smiled faintly. I'm just a man who made mistakes. Later that day, Daniel was called to the administrative office. The summons came through a polite message from HR. Mr. Reeves, please report to Dr. Collins' office at 3 p.m. He'd expected it. After all, hospitals ran on procedure. Saving a patient without credentials wasn't heroic in paperwork. It was a liability. The hallway leading to the office felt longer than usual. His palms were damp, his mind already bracing for the inevitable. Reprimand, maybe dismissal. But beneath the anxiety there was no regret. He knocked once. Come in, came the voice. Dr. Collins, the hospital's administrator, sat behind a desk covered in folders. Beside her sat Dr. Patel, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Clara was there too, standing near the window, her face pale with worry. Mr. Reeves, Collins began formally, gesturing for him to sit. Do you know why you're here? Daniel nodded. I think so. You intervened during a code blue yesterday morning, she said, her tone measured. Without authorization or current medical license. Yes, ma'am, Daniel replied calmly. I did. She leaned back, studying him. You're aware that such actions could have serious consequences? Yes, and yet you proceeded. Daniel hesitated, then spoke simply. Because a man was dying. And I knew how to help. Collins exchanged a glance with Patel, then flipped open a report. Dr. Patel, would you summarize your findings? Patel nodded, his voice low but steady. When I arrived, the patient was in cardiac arrest. The team was performing compressions, but oxygenation and rhythm were off. Mr. Reeves recognized the error, corrected the technique, and assisted with compressions. His intervention stabilized the patient before defibrillation restored pulse. In my professional assessment, he paused. His actions directly contributed to saving that patient's life. Clara looked down, her hands clasped tightly. Collins sighed, closing the file. This puts us in a difficult position, Mr. Reeves. What you did was medically unauthorized, but undeniably effective. You acted beyond your scope, but you did so flawlessly. Daniel's gaze was steady. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came here to clean floors. But when I heard the alarm, I forgot everything except the rhythm of a heart that needed help. The room went quiet. Dr. Collins stared at him for a long time before saying softly, You were a paramedic once. Yes, ma'am. What happened? Daniel's throat tightened. The words came slowly, each one weighted with years of silence. I lost my license after saving a man off duty, he said. There was an investigation. They said I broke protocol, acted without proper equipment. He lived, but they called it misconduct. After that, no department would hire me. Clara's eyes welled again, and even Dr. Patel looked away. Collins exhaled, her tone softening. That was unjust, Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe, but it taught me something. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean you'll be rewarded. You just do it anyway. No one spoke after that. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence like a heartbeat. Finally, Dr. Collins folded her hands. We're not here to punish you, Mr. Reeves. Quite the opposite. The hospital board wants to review your case, perhaps even help you regain your certification. We've reached out to the licensing bureau. They're willing to reopen your file. Daniel blinked. Reopen my file? Yes, Collins said with a faint smile. With testimony from Dr. Patel and Nurse Whitmore. Daniel's gaze flicked to Clara, who nodded slowly, tears glimmering. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest began to lift. The board hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. 3 days. That's all Daniel had to prepare, though there wasn't really anything to prepare for. He didn't have lawyers anymore. No appeals committee waiting to champion his case. No stack of new evidence. Just himself, the man who'd once held a license, a title, a life, and the same hands that had saved more people than the system ever acknowledged. The night before the hearing, he sat in his small apartment, one window, one flickering lamp, the faint hum of the city outside. On the kitchen table lay a single object, a folded letter, edges yellowed and fragile from years of being opened and closed again. The revocation notice. He read it again, though he'd memorized every word long ago. Unauthorized medical intervention. Violation of protocol. License permanently revoked. He had kept it not as a reminder of failure, but of truth, that systems can forget what hearts remember. Beside it lay a clean piece of paper, blank, untouched. After a long silence, he took a pen and began to write, not to the board, not to the hospital, but to himself. If tomorrow they tell me I can't hold a license, I'll still hold a heartbeat in my memory. If they call me reckless, I'll remember the faces of those who woke up breathing. And if they ask me why I did it, I'll tell them, because when you've heard the sound of a pulse returning under your hands, you never forget that music. He folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and turned off the light. The next morning, the hospital's conference room felt colder than usual. The blinds were half drawn, sunlight cutting thin lines across the table where 3 board members sat. Dr. Collins at the center, Dr. Patel on her right, and an ethics officer from the licensing bureau on her left. Clara sat in one of the chairs along the wall, clutching a notepad, though she hadn't written a word. Daniel entered quietly. No suit, no briefcase, just his pressed grey uniform, the same one he'd worn when the rumor began. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Collins greeted, her tone professional but kind. "Please have a seat." He nodded, sitting with hands clasped neatly on his lap. The ethics officer, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, began first. "We've reviewed your case history. It appears your original infraction occurred during an off-duty response in 2015. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "I performed an emergency airway insertion on a crash victim using a field kit I kept in my car. The hospital ruled it beyond my authority." The man nodded slowly. "But the patient survived." Daniel's eyes flickered downward. "He did. I visited him later. He told me he'd have died if I hadn't been there. Then why didn't you appeal further?" "I did," Daniel said quietly. 3 times. "But no one wants to argue against liability. It's easier to erase a name than admit a flaw in the system." The officer leaned back, eyes softening. "And yet you came back to work in a hospital." Daniel smiled faintly. "I still wanted to help. I just had to change how." There was a long pause. Dr. Patel broke it. "With your permission, I'd like to speak on his behalf." Collins nodded. "Please." Patel straightened, his voice steady but warm. "I've worked in emergency medicine for 15 years. I've seen plenty of well-trained professionals freeze under pressure. But what I saw in Mr. Reeves was instinct, the kind that doesn't come from a textbook. He acted without ego, without hesitation, and with absolute precision. I believe the board made a mistake years ago, and yesterday he proved it." Clara's throat tightened as she listened. Patel's words carried a weight of quiet authority that filled the room. Dr. Collins turned to Clara next. "Nurse Whitmore, would you like to add anything?" Clara rose slowly, palms slightly trembling. "Yes, ma'am." She glanced at Daniel, his eyes calm, encouraging, then back to the board. "When I first met Mr. Reeves, I judged him. I thought his uniform told me everything I needed to know. I was wrong." Her voice wavered. "He saved a life when I couldn't. But more than that, he showed me what compassion looks like when it's stripped of recognition. If anyone deserves to wear a badge again, it's him." Her words lingered in the air long after she sat down. The ethics officer folded his hands. "Mr. Reeves, one last question. If your license were reinstated, what would you do differently?" Daniel thought for a long moment. "I'd listen more. I'd speak less. And I'd never forget that the person cleaning the floor might know more about saving a life than the person giving orders." That drew a faint smile from Collins. The panel excused themselves to deliberate. The room fell into a heavy quiet, the kind where every second feels longer than a breath. Clara stared at the table, twisting a pen between her fingers. Daniel just sat still, his heartbeat steady, his hands resting on his knees. He'd already lived through losing everything once. There was nothing left to fear. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened. The board members returned. Dr. Collins remained standing. "Mr. Reeves," she began softly, "this hospital was founded on the belief that compassion and courage define medicine more than credentials ever could. Your past was marred by policy, but your actions here have reminded us what our profession truly means." She glanced toward her colleagues, then met his gaze. "Effective immediately. We're recommending the reinstatement of your paramedic license, pending retraining and evaluation. The hospital will sponsor your reinstatement program." The room went silent. Clara gasped softly, her eyes glistening. Dr. Patel smiled, exhaling relief. Daniel blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "You're reinstating me?" Collins nodded. "We are. And we'd like to offer you a position in the emergency department once your certification is complete." He sat there for a moment, motionless. The sound of a clock ticking filled the silence. 1 second, then another, before he finally whispered, "Thank you," but his voice cracked halfway through, and he had to look down to hide the moisture in his eyes. When the meeting adjourned, Clara followed him into the hallway. He walked slowly, almost dazed, as if his body hadn't yet caught up with the moment. "Daniel," she said softly, stepping beside him. He turned to her, smiling faintly. "Guess I'm not done yet." "You earned it," she said. "Every bit of it." He shook his head. "I didn't earn it. I just kept showing up." She looked at him, really looked, and said, "Sometimes that's what saving lives means." They walked side by side down the corridor, the morning light spilling in through the tall windows, painting both their reflections on the polished floor. For the first time they walked as equals. The reinstatement letter arrived 2 weeks later, printed on hospital stationery, stamped with the seal of the State Medical Board. It was brief and formal, but to Daniel Reeves, it felt like the heartbeat of a life returning. He held it in his hands, the way someone might cradle a fragile flame. It didn't erase the years he'd spent in silence, or the humiliation he'd endured, or the countless nights he'd walked home with aching hands and an empty sense of purpose. But it restored something deeper, dignity. He didn't frame the letter. He folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, right beside the one that had once taken everything away. The two pieces of paper, opposites in tone and weight, now sat together, one ending, one beginning, like mirrored scars that finally made sense. On his first day back in training, Daniel arrived early. The EMT classroom smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the same scent he'd lived in for years. Rows of young recruits filled the room, all nerves and ambition. They looked at him. The older man with silver streaks in his hair, with quiet curiosity. The instructor clapped him on the shoulder. "Glad to have you back, Reeves. The field needs people like you," Daniel smiled. "I'll try not to let anyone down this time." The man grinned. "You didn't let anyone down before. You just scared the wrong people." The words lingered with him all morning, when he practiced compressions on the training mannequin. The rhythm came back instantly, the measured press, the controlled breath, the silent conversation between life and timing. But this time there was no panic, no grief, no pressure, just focus. The kind that comes not from fear of failure, but peace with imperfection. That afternoon, as he passed through the hospital's main corridor on his way to the cafeteria, he heard a voice call out, "Mr. Reeves." He turned. Clara Whitmore jogged up to him, a bright smile on her face, a rare sight. She looked different now, more grounded, less rigid. "I heard the news," she said. "You're back. Looks that way," Daniel said, smiling softly.
"How are you holding up?"
"Better," she admitted. "I've been learning to slow down, listening more, even teaching the interns how to keep their composure under pressure." He raised an eyebrow, teasing. "Using my old methods?" "Trying to," she said with a laugh. Then her tone softened. "You changed the way I see this place. The way I see people." Daniel met her gaze. "You changed too. That's the real story here." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed him a small object, a penlight. "For you," she said. "You dropped yours that day in the ICU." He took it slowly. It was scratched, dented. Nothing remarkable, yet it carried the memory of chaos, redemption, and everything in between. "Thank you," he said quietly as she walked away. Daniel stood for a moment, rolling the penlight in his fingers, feeling its weight, not heavy but full. A reminder that sometimes light doesn't come from bulbs or machines, but from moments when you decide to act instead of stand still. That evening, Daniel found himself drawn back to the ICU, not out of duty, but closure. The ward was quieter now, dim lights reflecting off chrome rails and pale green walls. The patient he'd saved weeks ago was awake, propped up in bed, talking quietly with his wife. Daniel didn't go in. He didn't need to. The sound of laughter, gentle, relieved, human, was enough. He leaned against the doorframe, unseen, and smiled. Then he felt someone beside him. "Good to see you back," said Dr. Patel, stepping forward, arms folded. "Feels strange," Daniel admitted. "Like I never left, but also like it's not the same place anymore," Patel nodded. "Hospitals don't change. People do." They stood there a moment, watching the patient breathe. Patel glanced at him. "You know, when I started this job, I thought medicine was about saving bodies. You reminded me it's really about saving trust." Daniel's eyes softened. "Trust is fragile, but it's worth rebuilding," Patel smiled. "You've done that. You gave everyone here a lesson that'll outlast any training session." Daniel chuckled. "Funny thing, though. I came here to clean floors, not hearts." "Maybe," Patel said, smiling. "But you did both." Later, as Daniel left for the night, he passed the janitor's closet. The same small space where he'd once eaten lunch alone, leaning against a mop bucket. He paused, hand on the doorframe, staring at the bucket still sitting in the corner. He walked in, picked up the handle, and gave it a gentle push. It rolled forward with a squeak that echoed softly down the hallway. He smiled. "You and I have been through a lot," he whispered. "Time to retire, old friend," setting it aside. He stepped back into the corridor, the badge on his chest gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. Paramedic. Emergency Response Unit. As he walked away, a nurse passing by whispered to a colleague, "That's him, the janitor who saved a life." Daniel heard it, but he didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The truth had finally spoken for itself. Outside, the night air was cool, the sky clear. The sound of distant sirens drifted through the city, the same sound that once broke him, now calling him home again. He took a deep breath, eyes on the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded note he'd written before the hearing, and read the last line under the streetlight. "When you've heard the sound of a pulse returning under your hands, you never forget that music," he smiled, tucking it away, and walked toward the parking lot. Steady steps, no rush, no fear. Behind him, the hospital stood tall and silent, but inside, a story was being told about a man who was mocked, broken, and forgotten, until he reminded the world what courage looks like when no one's watching. Some laughter hides pride, some silence holds purpose, and sometimes the quietest hands save the loudest lives. 2 months later, the hospital had changed, not in its structure but in its atmosphere. People walked slower, spoke gentler. The tension that once filled the ICU seemed to have softened, replaced by an undercurrent of quiet respect. The story of the janitor who saved a patient had become something of a legend. New hires heard it during orientation, whispered with awe and a touch of reverence, as if Daniel Reeves were a myth that reminded them all why they'd chosen medicine in the first place. But Daniel never cared for the legend. He still clocked in early, still polished his shoes until they shone, still carried himself with the humility of someone who understood how easily respect can fade. He wasn't above anyone, just grateful to stand among them again. That morning, the sun filtered softly through the glass atrium, spilling light over the hospital lobby. Daniel stood by the coffee machine, filling a paper cup when Clara approached. Her posture was different now, still professional, still composed, but warmer, her voice unguarded. "Mr. Reeves," she said with a small smile. He turned, returning the smile. "Nurse Whitmore." "Clara," she corrected, rolling her eyes. "You've earned first-name rights by now," he chuckled softly. "All right, Clara, how's the ICU?" "Stable," she said, calmer somehow. "I think the staff's been thinking more before reacting." She hesitated. "I've been thinking more." Daniel nodded, sipping his coffee. "That's how we grow, between the silences." Clara studied him for a moment, then took a deep breath. You know, I used to think leadership meant control, that if I wasn't the loudest, I wasn't strong enough. Her gaze dropped. You showed me that quiet doesn't mean weak. It can mean certain. Daniel's smile softened. Sometimes the loudest room needs the calmest voice. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "There's something I've been meaning to give you." She reached into her bag and handed him a small framed photo. It was from the hospital charity gala the week before, a group shot of the ICU team. In the back, slightly to the side, Daniel stood in his uniform, unposed and unaware. But he was smiling. "You belong in this picture," she said simply. He took the frame gently, his thumb brushing over the glass. The moment caught in the photo, light, laughter, life, felt like something he'd fought years to reclaim. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd find my way back." "You didn't find it," Clara said. "You built it." That afternoon, Daniel visited the patient he had saved, Mr. Lawson. The man was sitting upright, reading a newspaper, color back in his face. When Daniel knocked gently on the door frame, Lawson looked up, eyes widening. "Well, if it isn't my guardian angel," he said, smiling. Daniel chuckled. "I'm just glad to see you up." "They told me everything," Lawson said, setting his paper aside. "You being a janitor, saving me, getting your license back. My wife says it's like something out of a movie." Daniel smiled. "Movies make it sound dramatic. Real life's quieter, more complicated." Lawson nodded, his expression turning sincere. "Complicated or not, you gave me a second chance. You didn't just save my life, Mr. Reeves. You gave my family back their peace." Daniel's throat tightened, emotion flickering behind his eyes. "You're very kind, sir." When he left the room, Clara was waiting outside, leaning against the wall. "He talks about you every morning," she said. "Says you're the reason he's alive, to complain about hospital food." Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "Then I'll take that as success." They walked together toward the lobby, where evening light slanted through the windows, turning the floors gold. For a long while they said nothing. Words felt too small for what had passed between them, two souls who had collided in conflict and emerged better for it. When they reached the elevator, Clara stopped and looked at him. "I don't know if I ever told you this," she said, "but that day, when you stepped in, I thought you were crossing a line." "You weren't wrong," Daniel said, smiling faintly. "I did," she nodded. "Yes, but I also learned that sometimes the line needs crossing, especially when it's drawn between pride and compassion." The elevator chimed. He stepped inside, holding the door. "You'll make a great head nurse one day, Clara." She blinked, surprised. "You really think so?" "I know so. You've already learned the hardest lesson, how to listen." The doors began to close, and she smiled, the kind of smile that held both apology and gratitude. "Goodbye, Daniel," he nodded once warmly. "See you around, Nurse Whitmore." That night, Daniel stood outside the hospital entrance, the sky streaked in violet and gold. Ambulances idled nearby, engines purring like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. He watched them, the flashing lights reflecting in his eyes, not as reminders of loss, but as symbols of renewal. He thought about everything the last months had taught him, that humility was not defeat, that compassion could come from anywhere, and that redemption isn't a single moment, it's a lifetime of choosing to rise again. He reached into his wallet and unfolded the two letters, one revoking his license, one restoring it, and smiled. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze before he folded them together, pressing them flat. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe I needed to lose my title to find my purpose." As he walked away, the hospital lights flickered behind him, steady, unwavering, eternal, like a heartbeat against the night, and somewhere inside. Clara finished her shift, pausing by the crash cart, tracing its handle with quiet reverence. A simple reminder that the tools of saving lives were nothing without the hands and hearts that guided them. "Some lines aren't meant to divide us," Daniel's voice echoed in her memory, "but to remind us where courage begins." The night settled. The heartbeat continued. Sometimes the quietest people teach the loudest lessons. In every hallway of the hospital, stories are written, not in ink, but in breath. Some are loud, celebrated, remembered. Others live quietly, unseen, beneath the rhythm of ordinary work. Daniel Reeves belonged to the latter kind, the invisible ones who hold the world together when no one is watching. He was mocked for his silence, dismissed for his uniform, forgotten by a system that measured worth by title. Yet when the moment came, he did what true healers do. He listened to the heartbeat of life itself and answered it. His story is not about heroism. It's about remembrance, that the essence of healing lies not in who holds authority, but in who refuses to turn away when a life trembles on the edge. Clara learned that day that pride can blind us, that humility can save us, and that sometimes the greatest teachers wear no badges at all. She carried that lesson into every shift thereafter, her compassion now deeper, her voice softer, and Daniel, the man once stripped of his license, found that redemption doesn't come from forgiveness or applause, but from rediscovering purpose after the world has forgotten your name. So, if you ever walk through a hospital and see someone quietly mopping the floor, fixing a light or pushing a cart, look twice, because sometimes behind those tired hands lives the same courage that steadies a heartbeat, the same strength that chooses mercy over pride. In a world too busy to notice, kindness still speaks, softly, steadily, like the rhythm of breath. Some laughter hides pride, some silence holds purpose, and sometimes the quietest hearts carry the loudest truth.